Hi everyone, we're going to talk about transformative learning. How to hold our clients and students through those moments which are really difficult in their development, but which hold great promise and opportunity on the other side. This video is going to introduce what transformative learning is, and it's going to set up an activity where you can reflect back on your own transformations. Through the learning together, we're going to predict and explain what the kind of common difficulties are that students might face at all different points in their learning. And we're going to think about how to design really effective ways to help support students so that they can overcome those hurdles. Now, the natural place to start is to think about what learning is, actually, if we're going to think about what transformative learning will be. We're going to give you a basic overview here, drawing from Jean Piaget in the bottom left, Jacques Mezereau, who coined the term transformative learning, and then Nud Illeris, who's taken the idea and developed it further. And broadly speaking, we're looking here at the constructivist tradition of psychology and learning theory. The main premise behind this way of understanding what learning is that as human beings, as learners, we generate new knowledge and meaning all the time. We just go about our lives and we make meaning through a very particular kind of interaction, right? So we have experiences, things happen to us, and then we actually have to make sense of them. We have to think about them and form ideas that explain those experiences. And then this kind of happens in a two-way process. We get new experiences, we have to make sense of them, and then we act based on our ideas and we get new experiences. So this is very different from, the approach to thinking about learning as, knowledge that we can just give to someone else. We cannot fill people up with knowledge. They have to actually have an active part in making sense of it. Hence, this is called constructivism, because we quite literally construct an understanding of the world. So the learner is someone who builds knowledge over time. And there's a kind of process where, through accumulating experiences and making sense of them, we kind of build up a mental map, a mental structure, in some cases called a schema, of the world. And that's how we kind of make sense of things. Okay? And basically over time, these schemas, these mental structures get more and more complex as we get new experiences and we form more nuanced and sophisticated ideas for explaining the world. Whenever we encounter new information, whenever we have a new experience, that in some way must be integrated with our old structures. We need to make sense of it based on what we already know. Now, this is really important because it means that what's happened to us, our history, our prior experiences, our beliefs and attitudes matter, okay? Because we have to be able to relate the new information to what we already know. And based on what we already know, we will make different sense of that material. It could be more challenging, less challenging, more interesting, less interesting, okay? So who the learner is matters a great deal in this way of thinking about learning. So there are actually four ways that this process of constructing knowledge can happen. Four kinds of learning within the theory. The first is called accumulation. And essentially this is where we just accumulate new small pieces of information. It's basically memorization. This happens where the new knowledge doesn't and actually cannot relate to things we already know, either because we don't know anything about it already, or just because it's kind of so small a piece of information that it kind of can't fit anywhere. If you think about memorizing a PIN number, it's just a kind of arbitrary string of numbers. It doesn't kind of relate to what we already know. Interestingly, this is where virtually all learning psychology started, and they were kind of measuring how individuals memorize small pieces of information. We now know that that's clearly not all that learning encompasses, and it's certainly not the most important form of learning. To understand the others, I'm just going to invite you to think of a small child, okay? Think of a small infant who's never really seen much of the world. The first time that they encounter a bird, in this case a house sparrow, this would be accumulation. It's just a new piece of information. They can't relate it to anything because they've never seen a bird before. Okay, it's just a thing with wings and a beak, and probably doesn't even know those words. It just is. Okay. They then encounter this. Okay, we know this as a pigeon, but the small child needs to make sense of this bird. Does it go into a new category? Probably not. It looks very similar to what it's seen before. It's a different colour, but it's also got wings, it has a beak, it moves in a similar way. And so we would call this learning assimilation, okay? Because the new knowledge becomes assimilated into the previous mental structures that have been created, okay? Nothing really needs to be changed in how the infant thinks. It's just that there's another kind of bird within what they know. And this could be the same even with something that looks, a little bit different, kind of stretching it a bit. This almost looks in some ways like, a dog, maybe? I don't know, it doesn't have 4 legs. But it's bigger, it doesn't have feathers everywhere. But still we can tell, broadly that this is a bird. I want you to now imagine that the infant then sees this in the sky. Okay? And this kind of moves in the air. It goes, has a lot of similarities to the things that it's seen, but it's clearly not a bird. So something needs to change. Something in the infant's mind needs to shift in order to accommodate the new information. Hence we would term this accommodation. They would have to change their category for things that move in the sky, and they would need to differentiate birds from planes. Okay? This is a kind of much more painful process. It's often resisted. It takes some effort for the individual to actually make sense of the information. It just doesn't fit with what they know already. Now, if you imagine that kind of discomfort even further, you get to transformation. I want you to imagine that you see a UFO in the sky. Maybe it looked completely different to this. You see an alien species. Okay? Your very way of relating to reality, actually, would completely change. You'd have to shift your understanding of the world. I suppose the only way you wouldn't is by reading lots of sci-fi or being someone that, believes in UFOs. But it changes your understanding not just of small categories of knowledge, but it changes the way you actually relate to the whole world. So we would say that is transformative learning. We don't just shift what we know, but we shift how we know it. Now let's move away from birds and planes and UFOs and talk about something slightly more relevant. So as a personal example, there's a few different forms of learning that I went through when I learned to teach, actually. So an example of accumulation on a teaching course might be, learning the name of the core text, knowing it's by John Biggs and Catherine Tang, knowing that it's the colour yellow. All of those are kind of very small, not very meaningful pieces of information, although, your behaviour can be changed by it. Knowing that the core text is the colour yellow, it's actually really helpful to avoid buying the wrong edition, for example, even if it doesn't quite, mean much. In terms of assimilation, well, there are lots of things on the course when I went through it that just kind of made sense to me. For example, deep and surface learning was a model, again, it's from Biggs and Tang, that just kind of made sense. It was interesting, and it kind of, gave some nuance to my, my understanding of what learning was. But it fundamentally didn't change anything. It stacked with all of my previous experiences of being a learner and of having done a bit of teaching. So it didn't change any of the categories that I had already. It just kind of gave a name and a bit more nuance to what I already knew. If we think about accommodation, actually there was an interesting piece of accommodation that I had with constructive alignment. There was actually a lot of fit here. I looked at it and I said, that just makes complete sense. Of course we should have learning objectives that are aligned with, the activities and the assessment. But in actually doing it, I found it surprisingly difficult to actually start with learning outcomes. I always wanted to jump ahead and think, okay, what do I want students to do? What's a fun activity? Or what do I really need them to know, rather than what should they be able to do? So I was led I came to realise basically that what I was doing didn't stack with, the actual ideas that I held. So there was a kind of cognitive dissonance in my own practice that arose, and I had to change the ways that I thought about my own teaching. I had to change the way I actually taught in order to make it more like the theory, and in this case that improved my teaching. We can also find elements or examples of accommodation when we get feedback, say, on our teaching, which, maybe is in our blind spot. Someone tells us, actually, do you realise that, you're not giving students enough time to answer questions? Your wait time is really short. That could prompt some accommodation because we haven't thought about it. It's not the way we see ourselves. So we actually have to have some kind of discomfort from the new feedback information there in order to do something with it. Now, on a similar level, I actually had quite a powerful moment of transformation in thinking about what the role of a teacher actually was. So Biggs's 3 levels of teaching here was actually quite transformative for me. As we know, level 1 teachers focus on what students are, grading, categorising them. Level 2 teachers focus on the teacher's performance, and at level 3 we focus on the actions and behaviours, activities of our students. Now again, this was something that made sense to me. So when I kind of received the information, it made sense. It didn't really challenge what I thought, but it certainly challenged what I did. I suddenly realised that I was utterly caught in being a kind of level 2 teacher, I suppose, between level 1 and level 2. And I say suddenly realised, but it actually took me months to fully recognise that my behaviours, my ways of thinking, my ways of evaluating whether lessons were successful in my own teaching was all to do with the teacher's performance. It's like on one level I thought that I was being a level 3 teacher, but I was unconsciously doing all of the things that a level 2 teacher would do. So there was a cognitive dissonance at play, actually in this case on an unconscious level. And it was uncomfortable, it was difficult. I had lots of moments of kind of realising I was, doing a level 2 thing here, or realising that I hadn't quite grasped some of the detail of level 3. And if I'm being honest, it took until, some months after I finished the programme until I felt that had really clicked and I'd got on a deep level what, visible learning was all about. So as we can see, transformative learning can take a long time. It involves not just a shift in what we know, what the categories are, but a shift in how we think and how we actually make sense of new information. And also often involves a change in who we are, who we think we are in a particular field. It changed my relationship with myself as a teacher and my view of the profession more broadly. The other thing to highlight here, though, as a bit of a caveat, is that all of this is hugely contingent. It depends on who the individual is. This particular thing was transformative for me at that time. It may not be transformative for, other people at various other points in their times. So who the individual is, their previous knowledge, their beliefs, their structures is entirely important when it comes to determining what kind of learning and what degree of cognitive conflict they're going to experience. Yourselves looking at a plane now doesn't cause you to accommodate what you know. And similarly, if you were a hunter-gatherer in ancient Greece, seeing a plane probably would be transformative to the way you understand the world and physics and your faith. So these 4 types of learning vary widely in when they actually manifest in particular learners, how powerful and potent they are when they arise, and they kind of look different in different situations as well. That said, there are some, broad things that we can identify here. Cumulative learning, so just knowing new things that disconnected arbitrary facts. That's most important in early childhood because you don't know very much. There's not, there isn't much information to slot new things into. So memorization actually plays a big part in child development, and that's fine. Similarly, transformative learning is right up the other end of the spectrum. That doesn't occur very often, and it's kind of hard to pinpoint when something is transformative because transformative episodes kind of are so long. They can actually take a while to fully manifest and resolve themselves, and they tend to occur actually in moments of crisis or kind of near crisis. The moments of transformative learning have a lot of significance for the learner, so there probably aren't very many of them. So assimilation and accommodation are the kind of two forms of learning that we do see, every day in the classroom. Things fitting neatly into people's minds or them having to change around little bits. These are kind of normal, everyday parts of learning. Now, it's worth considering what we should actually do about that. What it is that teachers, coaches, and mentors should actually do in their practice in order to support that kind of learning. Well, according to Piaget, at least, assimilation, accommodation, and transformation arguably all require an active learner. Okay, so this is because problem solving, making sense of the world, he actually thinks can't be taught. It's actually a capacity. It's kind of like a muscle that people have to build up through repeated episodes of having experiences and making sense of them. So we can't just give information to students. We can't just talk at them. They can't be passive. We need to get them active in being curious, in making sense and discovering the world. Okay? And this leads to a conception of teaching that you're probably very familiar with. Okay, this is stuff we talk about on the course all of the time. Learning should be student-centered, and we're aiming to facilitate individuals' learning. We're facilitating how they actually make sense of their experiences, rather than directly telling them what to think. And there's, a range of things that characterize this approach. Focusing on the process of learning, actually understanding how people think and make sense, rather than just focusing on the outcome and the product. There's a use of active methods that involve inquiry, have students discovering or reconstructing things that they think are true in order to understand why they're true. It involves the use of collaboration as well as individual activity, so there's social learning going on, and kind of problem-based learning where we perhaps deliberately design problems which will give disequilibrium to the learner. We actually want to cause some gentle, understandable and copable cognitive conflict so that they can use that as energy to learn. And there's certainly an emphasis here on evaluating what students are ready for. So not just what they know, but what's the level like in terms of how they know, what's their stage of development, so that we can set suitable tasks that address not just, their level of knowledge, but their capacity to actually understand the world and make changes. So at this point, let's return to transformative learning specifically. This is the most extreme, potentially most difficult form of learning our students might be going through. And so it's worth, being able to identify when students could be in this place and learning how to actually help them through it. That's going to be the focus of our session. So Carl Rogers calls this significant learning. It can be called expansive or transitional learning. Doesn't really matter. They generally involve the same kinds of things going on for the learner. So as we've talked about, there's a change not just to what you think, but to kind of how you think and who you are. Changes in how we organise ourselves as people and knowers. So this can involve differences in how we think, how we feel, and how we actually act and make choices in the world. Transformative learning comes about through challenges which we experience, we perceive as urgent, as unavoidable. So there's this idea that we kind of have near crisis episodes. It doesn't have to be an actual crisis, but it could be something that just has significant challenge, and it we feel it's necessary to change ourselves in order to get any further. We know that we have to adapt, we have to transform into a flying butterfly in order to escape what we're learning. We have to change, not just what we think. Now, this is obviously quite profound, quite extensive. There's a sense that what is being learned here is deep, it's big, So actually transformative learning can be brilliant, it can be joyful, it can be relieving and wonderful when we look back on it. But often in the moments when we're going through a piece of transformative learning, it can feel quite difficult, it can feel awful. We can have strong negative emotions, we can experience a lot of uncertainty because we are questioning not just things outside, but we're questioning ourselves, what we know and how we know. Jack Mesereau puts forward that there's a kind of typical process that people go through when they're experiencing transformative learning. I wonder if this looks at all familiar to you. It looks a bit like a Kolb cycle, doesn't it? Okay, so it's just a particularly profound experience here that we're learning from, caused by some kind of dilemma, some kind of problem or new information that's disorientating, that's difficult. We're probably in the centre of things asking, what can we do about this? What do we think about this? So it causes a need to examine ourselves. Then we have to think kind of critically about the situation that we're in. We have to assess what we need to do. Typically that has, a lot of doubt and uncertainty, and then people kind of recognise what the problem is. Okay, there's a moment we actually go, oof, yeah, it's about this. And that leads us to, actually explore and to consider options and think in ways that we hadn't thought before. At which point we'll probably plan a particular course of action in the situation to make sense of things, to try something different. We might acquire new knowledge. We'll probably try out different kinds of knowledge, because often in moments of transformative learning there isn't one fixed answer, otherwise we'd probably go and get the answer very quickly. So we kind of try on different hats, we inhabit different roles, we maybe try out different forms of knowledge that could be true, and we build competence, we build confidence in the roles that we try. We choose one, we start to believe in it, we start to inhabit it, and then we kind of reintegrate it with who we are. I had a moment of, you could say, transformation a few years into my teaching career, when I suddenly had a realization that I wasn't playing drums very much anymore. And so my dilemma was reconciling a new part of my identity, Jerry as a teacher as opposed to Jerry as a musician or Jerry as this. And so my dilemma at that point was kind of, which do I choose? I had to do a real kind of self-examination of who I felt I was, what I felt I wanted. It led me to, actually explore different ideas and different, senses of like what professional and personal means. It led to me, trying out a few different ways of thinking about myself. It led to me thinking about different ways that I could either, go back to music or, making a choice. In the end, the piece of learning was that there didn't have to be a choice, that, I could actually hold both identities simultaneously. But I had to kind of, muddle my way through that. And, the period before I could fully reintegrate that with myself and know that I can be both was quite long and quite tumultuous. So as I just started there, a good beginning point in helping students with transformative learning is to think about our own experiences, our own struggles in stepping up to particularly big challenges and dilemmas. Okay? And this is the prep that we're going to ask you to do. So we're going to ask you when and where in your own educational experience, learning your disciplines, what were your step-ups? What were your challenges? Where did you have to transform your understanding of what you were doing and who you were? What made stepping up in those situations hard? What made them difficult? What was it like to actually, go through a transformation? And what's it like now looking back on it? It's going to be really helpful to do this. It's going to be useful for us to actually be able to pinpoint what these challenges are, where they might arise for our students in the future, and to get an understanding of what it's actually like to go through those things, okay? To get a bit of empathy and understanding. Now, to help you identify your own moments of challenge and transformation, I just want to give you one extra kind of way to slice this. there are, according to lots of learning theorists, 3 different dimensions to learning. So 3 kinds of challenges that we might have experienced. The first one is all to do with how we think and how we perform in our discipline. So this is the cognitive dimension. It's to do with the intellectual content of what we learn. It's to do with how we think. It's to do with our understanding about the standards of performance in music or other creative endeavours. Lots of people encounter cognitive step-ups when doing their masters, actually. For example, the idea that knowledge itself isn't actually ever true or false. Usually it's always provisional, it's always contested. Or think about much earlier in learning music, often the concept of subdivision is really powerful. It's transformative, changes the way you think about music and how you understand the building blocks and how to put them back together. The second kind of challenge relates to how we feel, how we know ourselves, how we relate to ourselves, and how we relate to other people. So this is the affective dimension, to do with the person and our identity. I've already given an example about, my own step up in learning to have kind of multiple professional identities. That would be an affective challenge and transformation. Similarly, another one that tends to come up for a lot of people is learning that not everyone else is feeling and thinking all the things that they are feeling and thinking. So people often kind of worry, and I certainly did this as well, we worry about what other people think, forgetting that everyone else is concerned with what they think and how other people are viewing them, right? And so it actually becomes this release when we suddenly understand that everyone is concerned with their own little worlds in their own little heads, that they're not inside and living all of our thoughts and often self-criticisms. And the third dimension of challenge relates to how we act, the choices we make, the ways that we study, living independently and professionally. And so this is the conative dimension, all about choice and action. Okay. For example, people experience big step-ups here when it comes to, say, working their first job. Not having their parents or school accountable for actually getting up in the morning. You suddenly have to do it. You have to hold yourself accountable to some of these things, even when you don't want to do it. Later in life, when people do their undergrads, often they report big challenges here with navigating the freedom that comes with it. Freedom in how you spend your time, freedom in what you focus on in your assignments, freedom of not having someone telling you what to do all the time. Again, or even further than that, after they finish their degree and suddenly having to choose a career, there's this unfolding dimension of freedom, I suppose, that we all go through. Lots of other kinds of challenge that might relate to how we act, how we make choices. So you see there are kind of 3 main areas: the cognitive, the affective, and the conative. And I'm going to invite you to think about those 3 areas and kind of chart to yourself. Where do you think your big step-ups, where have your challenges and transformations been? I'm going to ask you to think specifically about your learning as it relates to your discipline, your craft, so music, performance, theatre, anything like that. These things can be heavily personal, so I think if we keep our focus on the subject, it's going to make it just a little bit easier, and it's going to make it probably more transferable to some of the students, but feel free to capture what's useful for you. So for the class, I want you to identify, let's say, 3 to 4 main step-ups, main challenges that you've gone through as it relates to your discipline. But maybe also think about, what do you imagine the step-ups that your students or your clients might be facing right now? Have a think about whether you can spot any of this going on with the people that you're directly working with. And think about whether this is actually, what makes these things difficult. Try and think about what the experiences are like. And we'll take this to class and we'll have some really good discussions, both about the challenges themselves, but also what we do about them. Okay? That's it for now. I hope you have a good week, and we'll catch you in the session. Bye.